All right, we're recording.
3, 2, 1. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest episode of Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety. This is Kenny Ray coming to you live from the great state of Texas, and I'm joined today by my colleague and co-podcast uh, podcaster, Barry. I don't know what that term means, but Mr. Barry Harrison from the great state of Oklahoma. And both Mike and Jim are out today. And so Barry and I will be carrying this episode by ourselves. And we want to share with the listeners, and we know our listeners are primarily made up of three groups. There are owners and decision makers at trucking companies. There are safety directors and safety staffs at trucking companies. And there are drivers. And then we have a few folks that are really unrelated to trucking, but for whatever reason, they find our podcast interesting. Our presentation today will be mostly geared to those first three groups because we are going to discuss two pending regulatory items that by the time this podcast is broadcast, which basically will be the third week of June 2025, both of these regulatory changes will have been implemented. There's speculation about how smoothly they will roll out, and I think Barry will address that in a minute, both from his perspective as a prior professional truck driver and a safety director at a fairly large motor carrier in North Oklahoma. But we'll just see. The feds say that these are going to work well, and we'll just find out. But the first of those changes is the FMCSA's medical certification reporting changes that go into effect June 23rd of 2025. And we will discuss that one first, and then we will pivot and discuss a change that is going into effect June 25th of 2025, just 2 days later, concerning the English Language Proficiency requirement and the fact that that has now been made an enforceable out-of-service item by CVSA. And Barry, I have to tell you, having been involved in federal motor carrier safety regulations, at least since Texas adopted them in 1987, I don't ever remember in my career two really significant regulatory changes that came out almost on the same day. I mean, there basically is 1 day between these two. But the first one is the changes to the medical certification reporting process. And the FMCSA claims that they're making these changes for several reasons. And I'm going to lay these out, and then I'm going to get you to address them from your perspective as a former driver and as a safety director that managed the medical certification program for your motor carrier. But FMCSA is hoping that this change will, number one, help eliminate fraud through counterfeit or altered medical cards. They are hoping it will reduce paperwork for drivers, for medical examiners, employers, and the state driver's license agencies. They're hoping that it will speed up the updates to the driver's records. And we know how frustrating that is right now in our industry, where a driver goes and gets a medical certificate, and then the whole process of trying to get it to the state driver's license agency, and then hope it gets put on his MVR and all of that. FMCSA is claiming this is going to speed that up. And then the last one and this is one thing our podcast has always been interested in from the time we started, now 3 years ago, enhancing public safety by ensuring that only medically qualified drivers operate commercial vehicles. So June 23rd, 2025, the system is going to change for medical certification. And Mr. Barry Harrison, I will yield to you and let you share your comments, and then I'll make some myself.
Definitely, Kenny. And again, to kind of echo what you said, this is unprecedented, really, with two major changes coming down the pipe in terms of regulation. And I have to say that usually FMCSA gives us a lot of time in between these kind of changes to absorb some of that. But hey, one thing about the trucking industry, from drivers all the way up to CEOs, is we are resilient, and we always roll with the punches. So, when you called me and said, "Hey, we need to get this on the books and we need to get this recorded," I was so excited to be able to talk about something that, just to help our clients and any listeners that we may have, just prepare for this. And if you haven't already been preparing a little bit, let's not fret. Take some of this information and put it into good practice. Um, but just to kind of jump in and talk about this medical certification process, I remember when you had to physically take a copy of it into the DMV here in Oklahoma, and they had to stamp it for you, and then you kind of prayed that everything would work, the systems would link, and things like that. So, Kenny, as you talked a little bit about, not while we roll with the punches, I'm always very skeptical when anything in terms of technology is rolled out by FMCSA, SDLA. We have to think about it. There's so many systems that are having to link and talk to one another to ensure that these things are happening. And really, when I read the one of the memos that FMCSA put out, I I just directly went to, in my head, okay, first of all, when is my med card going to expire? And then second of all, how does this process, how does it affect me? And that's always kind of my first line of thought is, how does this affect me as a driver? And yes, I still have a Class A CDL, so, and I still am an interstate driver, so I do keep that medical card, and that's simply just so that I can be very familiar with that process here in Oklahoma. So I kind of skip around the memo a little bit, and I just go right down to, the steps by a driver to ensure successful transmission. And there are some great points on this document, and we'll try to get a link to this document, and the one that our office is officially going to put out in the notes of this episode. But you know, really, the first suggestion I have for anyone that's doing this is, if if that medical examiner will allow you, sit there with them or their staff while they enter in this information. And at the very least, if you do nothing else and that medical examiner or their staff doesn't ask you to give them a copy of your CDL so that they can actually make a physical copy of it, you need to remind them to do that. Because again, we've got to have full faith in these people, because we don't have access to the national registry. It's only the examiners and other state and federal officials that have that access. And so if you do, if an issue doesn't occur and you do get a letter that says, "Hey, we're going to downgrade your CDL because your medical certificate has lapsed," the last thing they put on there is, step one, call the medical examiners or their office, tell them that there's an issue. Second step is to call your state driver's license, their offices. So in Oklahoma, it's Service Oklahoma, and if you can't get the issue resolved there, they give you a lovely 1-800 number for the National Registry, where you can sit on hold for a long time and stuff. So I'm the kind of person, even as a safety director, the more control I felt I had over a process, the better I felt. And you know, to to give an example of kind of them rolling out something that was heavily based on technology, the best example would have to be the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. And I remember
Yeah.
when I was still a client, I was talking to Kenny going, okay, this thing goes live January 6th, 2020. We had time. We were in the midst of COVID was kind of beginning to happen. And so I would sit on that website and then here January 6th comes and the website crashes. So
Yeah.
that's where I have some hesitation about, man, I'm not I don't have a lot of faith that it comes out real smooth, but I could be wrong and I hope I am. And that's part of the reason why we saw this pushed back by a few years because the IT departments threw their hands up and said, "Hey, we're not exactly sure this is going to go seamless." So I hope that given that time, um, it will go smooth. But again, just to reiterate, if they will allow you to stand there, sit there, whatever, and you can watch them physically put in your information, which it's gonna basically ping the SDLA website for your last name, your driver's license number, just real pertinent information that should pull your information and make sure that those two marry up and everything is good. Um,
Yeah. And Barry, it's interesting you brought up the rollout of the clearinghouse. And, you and I have discussed that offline. And what was really the comparison here and what's kind of frightening to you and I both was that was a single federal system. Here, we've got a federal system interacting with all of the state systems as if nothing could go wrong with that process. And I love the pointer and the tips you gave to the drivers. I want to back up just a second for our owners and safety directors and share a couple of thoughts. And Barry, anything I mention, you feel free to chime in. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, the requirements, the physical requirements, qualifications, and examinations out of Part 391, which basically is 391.41 through 391.49 for you safety directors, those haven't changed. The driver is still going to go down to the doctor's office, to the clinic, wherever, and go for their what they call a DOT physical, the FMCSA physical. What's changing is what happens after that driver gets that physical. Because at that point, the medical examiner, whoever that is, whether that's a doctor, a nurse practitioner, chiropractor, whoever's qualified and is in the national registry, once they conduct that medical examination, they are not going to give a paper copy of that DOT medical card to the driver. They are going to upload that electronically to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, specifically into the database that's being set up to house all these, the national registry that's going to house all these medical certificates. FMCSA then automatically is supposed to forward that out. And in Barry's case, and we're always proud that we actually have a professional truck driver as part of our driving the line team. But for Barry, he goes down to the doctor does the physical, doctor uploads the results of that physical, and then FMCSA turns right around and sends that to the great state of Oklahoma, which is the state where Barry has his CDL. And then that is supposed to work flawlessly. And then that magically gets assigned or gets put on Barry's MVR, his motor vehicle record for the state of Oklahoma. And then if he was still a professional driver working for a motor carrier, the motor carrier at that point would go in and run an MVR to make sure that Barry's medical certificate had been hooked up or joined electronically, if you will, to his CDL. And what Barry was sharing, and it was fantastic information, is what a driver should do if that system doesn't work. And again, he laid out the 3 steps that FMCSA has said. And basically, it is go back to the doctor's office, say, hey, there's something wrong. Can y'all check what you uploaded? That doesn't work. And I heard the skepticism in Barry's voice on the next 2 things. Reach out to your state driver's license agency. And hopefully you can get a real person that will take the time to look up your issue. And then third, they've created a way to actually contact the feds and see if you can get any resolution there. So how would a driver know? And Barry, I want to propose two things to you and then want your comments on this. Some of the states are very, very good about notifying a driver if their CDL gets downgraded. So if this system doesn't work, some drivers in some states may open their mailbox and there'll be a letter in there from their state driver's license agency basically saying your Class A CDL is now an operator's license. All you can do is drive your pickup or your car or your motorcycle. You can't drive a big truck anymore. The other way, and this is the one that is probably the most frightening for drivers, is they get stopped on a roadside inspection, whether they pull into the scales or get stopped by a trooper on the side of the road. And the officer, when they run it, comes back to the driver and says, "Driver, I'm sorry. I hate to tell you this, but you don't have a CDL. Your license has been downgraded to an operator's license." So, and Barry, I know that not only are you formerly a professional driver, but you also were safety director at a fairly large trucking company, and you dealt with drivers. Did you ever run into that issue where you had a driver whose CDL got downgraded because of a medical card issue?
Oh, absolutely, Kenny. And to share probably my most frustrating experience with this, and again, we go back to I had an Oklahoma driver who got his medical card. Everything was good. It was good for 2 years. Um, but we all know that doctors have just lovely handwriting, right? and and on that medical card, it appeared that they certified it for 1 day. And this is
Wow.
where it's very important for you as safety directors, as drivers, whomever. Now, as Kenny mentioned, they're not going to give you a physical copy of that card usually, but you can request that from them. And I would say, if these situations arise from a data queue perspective, encourage your drivers, and drivers, please, please, please request a copy of that card so that you can keep it for your records. Now, to go back to my example, we're in Louisiana, and driver, they misread it through Service Oklahoma here in Oklahoma, and it was so literally I'm arguing regulation with the Service Oklahoma people, saying you can't certify it for a day. This was it's yeah, it's not clear, but it's got to be for a year, it's got to be for 90 days, it's got to be for 6 months, what have you. And finally they conceded to the fact that, hey, this was bad handwriting. It's still, it cost us severely because the driver's out of service at that point, and
Exactly. Yep.
there's nothing the roadside inspector can do to let him go, because what he reads is gospel. So
Right. Yep.
I'm pleading with this guy roadside to say, look at the physical paper that he has. And finally, it took me a day to get it all cleared up. And the service, I have to say, the Service Oklahoma people did a really good job of getting back to me in a timely manner. It They got it back to us in a timely manner, and I was able to correct that issue relatively quick. Like I said, though, it took me a day to get it done. I would have hated to imagine, if nobody would have answered the phone or anything like that, how long it could have taken to get that issue resolved.
Absolutely. Yep. And so, Barry, you mentioned what to do if a driver has an issue after the physical and realizes that the electronic part, the uploading, all of that stuff didn't work. But ahead of time, and you and I both have seen drivers that wait till the week that their medical card is supposed to expire. And from my perspective, also as a former safety director, but certainly not a professional truck driver, it seems to me, because of the uncertainty of this process, particularly in the early stages. And again, we compared it to the clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse is runs fairly smoothly now, but it didn't at the start. So we both have a little skepticism about this process. But I think it would be beneficial for drivers to start the process much sooner than some of them often do. What are your thoughts on that about them, figuring out uh, when does my medical card expire and should I go ahead and go see the doctor now?
I you're absolutely right and spot on. I One of the things that's on this memo that was sent out was, begin the certification process with a medical examiner well in advance of the current medical examiner's certificate expiring to allow time for errors to be corrected in the driver data validation process if they occur. So I would say at least 10 days out. That gives you 10 business days, because you have to think about it. They have until midnight of the following day. So if they did let's just say I went down to the clinic right now and got a physical, they would have to have that submitted to the National Registry database before midnight tomorrow night. So think about that. Things can happen. And if it gets kicked back, we're not sure, are they going to get it are they going to be monitoring that regularly? Or so, that's where the fear I have comes in. It's, I don't have any way to see this. Does the medical professional and their team really understand what could happen if this doesn't go smooth? So Kenny, you're absolutely right. Again, I would say at minimum 10 days out,
Yeah.
get in there, get seen, get your physical completed, and then that way you're still on your old card for that 10 days. And if anything happens, I would say give 5 days of quote unquote grace for if issues happen and communication has to bounce back and forth between the two softwares.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that you and I both would encourage our fellow safety directors out there to get ahead of this whole thing. Check all the expiration dates on your drivers, and you be the motivator to get them in and get them in there early. So to wrap up on the medical certification changes, they go into effect June 23rd of 2025. That's the launch date. FMCSA again says they're making these changes to help eliminate fraud from counterfeit or altered medical cards. They're trying to reduce paperwork across our industry, that is, for drivers, for motor carriers, medical examiners, and the state driver's license agencies. They're wanting to speed up the entire process, and we hope that part of it works. And ultimately, they're wanting to enhance public safety by ensuring that only medically qualified drivers operate commercial vehicles. And the advice that Barry, as a former professional driver, gives to our drivers is get in early, at least a minimum of 10 days early, and then make sure your safety director or whoever does it at your company, maybe HR, runs an MVR to make sure the process worked right. If it didn't, remember the 3 steps that Barry outlined. First of all, contact the medical examiner, see if they can fix it on their end. If they can't, or you don't get any resolution there, contact your state driver's license agency. And if you still don't get any resolution, then FMCSA has actually set up both a email and a phone number to their National Registry help desk. And Barry, one last point I want to make on this, because you and I both have some clients that have mixed fleets. Those of you that have commercial motor vehicles that do not require a CDL, so that is those 10,001 to 26,000 GVR vehicles, the medical requirements for them have not changed. Those drivers will still get an original paper medical certificate, and there's none of this process we've been discussing affects those non-CDL holders. So some of y'all that manage multiple size fleets, you're going to need to remember that nothing has changed on your non-CDL driver. And Barry, you referenced a really good publication from FMCSA. Is it the one that at the top it says National Registry 2 fact sheet for drivers, or have you got a different one than that?
That's the one.
Okay, all right. So and you're much more technically competent than I am on a computer. So if somebody wants to get that National Registry fact sheet, and I'm assuming that Miss Aaron will make a link for the podcast, but for people listening, what do they do? They just get on Google and type in what?
That's what I did. I just changes to National Registry, um, upcoming FMCSA, and it
Okay.
was the first one that came up, and it was right off of FMCSA's website.
Okay, and they actually did a good job with that fact sheet. It's pretty easy to read and it's very, very understandable. Okay, so now we're going to pivot. So that's June 23rd on the changes to the medical certification process. Just 2 days later, on June 25th, and this one has garnered much more publicity, even outside of the trucking circles. And within trucking, there's a lot of conversation going on about that medical certification because that affects a driver, basically his or her CDL. It almost nullifies your CDL if you don't have a valid medical card. So, those of us in the industry, we're hearing a lot of conversation about that. But this second topic of the English language proficiency for drivers is even making the national news for folks that aren't even involved in the trucking industry. And this goes into effect on June 25th. And this basically, what it is, it's adding out of service criteria and enforcement action to a federal regulation that has been that has been codified or in the law for many, many years. Many years. It's not a new law. I want folks to understand this. This comes straight out of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, out of 391.11, subparagraph B, and it basically says that a person is qualified to drive a motor vehicle if he or she can read and speak the English language sufficiently to converse with the general public, to understand highway traffic signs and signals in the English language, to respond to official inquiries, and to make entries on reports and records. And Barry, I actually looked something up that came from a law firm has for many years been a friend to the trucking industry, and that's the Scopelitis law firm. They actually put out a white paper on this, and that English language requirement has actually been in federal law since 1936. So it's not a new law at all. Uh, what makes this interesting, and again, we never discuss politics on this podcast. That is not our role. But you would sit and say, well, if the law's been around since 1936, why is it just now an issue? It's an issue because various administrations, basically over the last 90 years, have decided yay or nay whether or not they're going to enforce it. That's the political part of it. And so the current administration that's in Washington has decided, hey, we're going to enforce this. And so effective, again, June 25th, this English language proficiency is coming into effect. So what this means for your drivers is if and when they are stopped for a roadside inspection or a post crash inspection, if they're involved in a crash, let's say it's a minor crash, nobody's hurt, but law enforcement responds and your driver's there. It's basically if your driver has interaction with the law enforcement community, this English language proficiency requirement is going to come into play. And it'll be like this. The officer will basically start a conversation, walk up to the truck and say, good morning, driver. How you doing? I'm going to do a roadside inspection on your truck. And if the driver is unable to converse with that inspector, whether it's a civilian inspector at a port of entry or if it's a trooper or a law enforcement officer that enforces federal motor carrier safety regulations, if there's any indication to that officer that this driver may not be able to meet this English language proficiency, then at that point, the inspector is going to go into a process that has now been laid out for them. And Barry, we'll talk about that process in just a second, but I've actually had some people, this has been a hot topic of conversation over the past month or so, and I've had people ask me, well, what is the purpose of this? Is it just political to, to punish people that aren't conversant in the English language. And ladies and gentlemen, it's actually a safety issue in two regards. The biggest one, and the one that's being most publicized, is whether or not drivers can properly read roadside signs that may give them an indication of a road hazard ahead of them. And this has come as a result of two or three pretty high profile crashes involving drivers who later were found to be deficient in speaking the English language, and they appear to have missed some highway signs that would have given them an indication that there was a hazard in front of them, and ended up in very, very bad crashes. The other reason is because when inspectors are doing roadside inspections, particularly if they're doing a level one inspection, it means an officer is going to physically get under that truck and trailer. Probably on a creeper. Some states have pits that the driver pulls across. But if that driver cannot understand the directions that are being issued to operate various pieces of equipment on that truck and trailer while that officer is under it, they could accidentally, inadvertently put that tractor into gear and literally run over somebody. And so it's an officer safety issue, and it is also an issue for the general motoring public. And so basically, your driver gets stopped for a routine roadside inspection. The officer walks up, begins conversation, and something keys to the officer. Hey, this driver is either not understanding me, or I can't understand him or her. And then we would basically move into this protocol. And the protocol, Barry, is basically going to be a series of questions. We're still waiting to get final verification from FMCSA what those are. However, several years ago, FMCSA posed a set of questions. They had 12 specifically, and then there were two additional ones for hazmat carriers. So the possibility of 14 questions being asked of a driver, but they're very basic things like the origin, destination of the load. How long have you been driving? How long have you been on duty? Just questions like that. And then if the driver if the officer is still not comfortable with the level of proficiency in the English language, there's actually going to be a sign test where whether the officer has a laminated card or what, we're still not real sure how that part's going to work out. But basically, the officer would show some of the standard routine roadside signs that are universally accepted across our country, including pictures of some of the newer electronic signs, those ones that the message can actually be changed on, and the driver will be expected to read what is on that sign. And so, Barry, what are your thoughts on this whole process that comes into play on June 25th about the English language proficiency requirement?
And Kenny, you did an excellent job laying it out there, and what the inspectors are going to be expected to do when these drivers get pulled over. Um, I say this tongue in cheek, coming from Central Oklahoma, and I've been raised with some good old boys, and heck, even myself, sometimes I talk, and people can't hardly understand me, and so. I always laugh about that a little bit, and being able to converse with people. Um, where my mind goes is being comfortable with the roadside officer. Even if you're on the cusp of being proficient or not, it's it can be a high stress situation. And one of the questions that I saw too that they can ask is a question about a vehicle component or system. Um, to me, again, it goes back to training. If they ask an obscure question about how something works or what have you, and I don't see roadside officers doing that, but you've got to be able to explain those components and what it does, and and to the point of it being satisfactory for that officer, so that they can understand that. And the other place my mind goes with the road signs would be, if they put up when I get into eastern Oklahoma, I see those pictures of bears or other wildlife and things like that. It's there's many things that can be flashed in front of you, and even from my perspective, and I'll humbly admit, I probably need to go over those signs again and make sure I understand what they are. So again, let's not just look at this from the view of it's these people that can't speak that way that can cause these incidents to happen. Um, it could be a good training topic for you just to go over signs and make sure that people understand, what I think we've talked about it in the past. What is utility work as opposed to road work? Things like that. That's honestly when I first started reading about this a few months ago, that's where my mind went was, man, sometimes these signs are tough to understand anyway. But and I completely understand where the dangers come in. I used to talk to guys all the time about Cabbage Pass and all those big mountain passes that's where in my opinion, a lot of the true dangers come in. And that's just tough even if you're a new driver on how to navigate those passes. When you're coming off a hill, you want to be going as slow as you can. You want to, trust the Jake brake, trust the transmission so that it's going to hold you. And if these people can't understand that by seeing the signs for different grades, and you know seeing the signs for if you have a runaway truck, this is what you do, kind of thing, then boy, it is very scary what could go on.
Yeah.
um
And Barry, before you go on with that, we've talked about kind of what this thing looks like and how a driver can encounter it. But one thing that makes this different than what's been done in the past with this English language proficiency is that effective June 25th, if a driver cannot satisfy to that officer's satisfaction that he or she can converse in the English language to answer those basic questions and to relate what the signs mean that may be pointed out, they're going to be put out of service. And and you and I have been in this business a long time. I want to make a point here. If a truck pulls into the scales and they do an inspection on it, and let's say the tail lights are out on the trailer, and they put the driver out of service. Well, for him to be back in service or her to be back in service, they fixed their tail lights. And once the tail lights are working, they still had a violation at the time, but once they get the tail lights working, they're back in service and they go down the road. Or let's say the driver pulls in and he or she's over on their hours, and they put them out of service for violating Part 395 of the hours of service. Well, as soon as the driver takes that break and has enough hours to drive again, they're back in service. But here, think about it, Barry. You're out of service until you can speak the English language. I mean, this is not going to be a quick fix.
no.
And we've got motor carriers that have some of them haul freight that is very timely. I'm thinking about livestock. I'm thinking about reefer outfits that are hauling food. And your driver's 1,000 miles from home, and you get a call from the state of Vermont. If you're out of Texas or the state of Washington, they say, we've got your driver and he's out of service until he can speak English. And they're your truck and trailer and loads 1,000 miles from home. And the point I'm making about this is we know it's coming into effect June 25th, but a lot of people that listen to our podcast are officials at motor carriers, safety directors, owners, or whatever. So for those folks, you got to start asking yourself, what can I do as the trucking company? What can I do as a decision maker at the motor carrier to be prepared? And I think you've got to think bigger than just, do I have drivers that can speak English? I mean, this starts getting into your recruiting, your onboarding, your training. I mean, you've got to start thinking, when I hire a driver, can they converse well enough in English that my truck is not going to get put out of service uh, 10 days from now, whenever I have that truck out on the road. So you've got to start thinking about that. If you've got drivers that have difficulty conversing well in English, is there a way you can coach them? Is there a way you can train them? You've got to start figuring out what am I going to do if I have drivers. And Barry, with me in Texas, and probably this affects you and Jim the same way in Oklahoma. We immediately think of the Spanish language because we have so many Spanish speaking drivers. But I was talking to Mike Bohan, one of our co-hosts, the other day, and Mike has several of his clients that Spanish is not the language. There's some motor carriers that have roots in certain of the Eastern European countries, and we've got companies that the drivers speak Russian. We have companies where the drivers speak Serbian. So it's not. This isn't a Spanish language. It's any non-English speaking, and so each motor carrier is going to have to look and say, number one, does this impact me? And if it does, what can I do to get prepared for it? Because, ladies and gentlemen, we're not getting any indication whatsoever that FMCSA is going to back off on this. And then one other thing, and then Barry, I'll yield to you and let you make final comments, and then we'll close. But some of the states are making decisions about whether or not they're going to enforce this on intra-state. And I'm down in Texas, and our enforcement agency, which is the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas Highway Patrol, has made the decision they're not going to put drivers out of service for intra-state movements. But it's very incumbent for our listeners to remember what the criteria between inter and intra-state is. It is based on the movement of the load, not necessarily the movement of the truck. And that is going to impact a lot of our drayage outfits that operate in and around the ports. And again, I'm in Texas, so Houston is big on our radar down here. And so we'll have a ship come in from out of the country. It doesn't matter where it comes from. That's got 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 intermodal containers on it, boxes on it, and they'll use cranes and unload that ship. And every one of those boxes will either be put on a rail car, or be put on a chassis, and a truck will come out of the port of Houston and hit a public highway there in the city limits of Houston. That is an interstate move. Even if that truck goes one block in the city of Houston, that's an interstate move. And most of our major cities, the city police department, the sheriff's office also enforces federal motor carrier safety regulations in addition to the state highway patrol. And so I'm very concerned about the impact this is going to have on drayage operations at the various ports around our country. And so I just want motor carriers to start thinking this is not just an out of service item for you to worry about one truck, one driver. You've got to look at this in its totality. How does this impact your company, your overall operation, all the way from recruiting to where you have drivers actually out on the road? And so, Barry, anything you want to add before we close this session talking about the English language proficiency and the fact the out of service criteria goes into effect June 25th?
Well, one thing I wanted to add was, and if you've got trucks moving through Oklahoma, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Senate Bill 20, which was passed this past session. And just to read a section out of it, an operator of a commercial motor vehicle within this state shall be able to demonstrate proficiency of the English language sufficient to converse with the general public, understand highway signs and signals in the English language, respond to official inquiries, and make entries on reports and records. Now, what happens if they can't do that would be a $3,000 fine to the company, to the motor carrier, and then that driver will be fined up to $1,000 or by imprisonment for not more than 90 days, or both. And just as Kenny said, they're going to put you out of service. And then what's kind of interesting about this is within 12 hours, so they're going to give you 12 hours from when they go out of service. If you can't produce a driver who can move that freight, they're going to actually call the owner of the freight, and they're going to let them know what's going on, and they're going to offer them the option to transload that onto a different truck so that they can get their freight down the road. And that's to no charge to the customer who actually owns the freight. Now, what was interesting too, and I'll tie this in with our first topic, um, they also added um, that you must possess a valid commercial driver's license to operate a CMV, right? That makes sense. Where this comes in with the med card is if I'm downgraded to a class D, that can also be in effect here. If I no longer have a class A CDL and I don't know that I've been downgraded or anything like that, you're subject to the same criteria as this English proficiency here. So we need to keep that in mind that through both of these processes, vetting drivers properly on the English language proficiency, but also making sure that we get a tried and true system in place for when those med cards are being updated so that there's no hiccup in the system so that we don't have someone driving down the road that we know did get a physical, all those things, but due to a clerical error, it's not getting pushed through. So again, create that process. Once you determine that that process does work, stick with it, and then use it on all of your drivers.
Excellent points. And the most profound thing that the point you just made was the fact that several of the states, many of the states, are having either supplementary or parallel legislation at the state level that impacts these various same two topics anyway. So for interstate movement across our country, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations are in effect. So both of these things, the medical certification reporting changes June 23rd, 2025, and the English language proficiency, including the out of service criteria, June 25th, 2025. Both of those are in effect on those dates for interstate movement. But just like Barry just pointed out, it is incumbent upon you, safety directors, owners of trucking companies, figure out, are there state laws that could also impact you? And you just heard the penalties out of the state of Oklahoma, very severe. And letting you know that some of these states have enacted state legislation that could have very adverse effects on your drivers and your operation. So, Barry, what a joy it has been for me for you and I to have this particular episode of Driving the Line. And we look forward to the next time that our two brothers, Mike Bohan and Jim Seibert, can be back with us. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. And please don't forget the dates, June 23rd, 2025 for the medical certification reporting changes, and June 25th, 2025 for the English language proficiency requirement, including the out of service criteria as developed by CVSA. So on behalf of Mr. Barry Harrison, again, this is Kenny Ray. Thank you for joining us on this issue, this episode of Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in pursuit of safety. And we will catch you next time. Thank you very much.